The night my wife, Emily, brought her boyfriend home to announce her pregnancy, I thought I had finally lost my mind. We had been married for 7 years. 7 years of laughter, shared dreams, and quiet Sunday mornings where she would hum old jazz songs while making coffee. I thought we were happy, or at least normal. That illusion shattered the moment she walked into our living room, holding another man's hand. "This is Mark," she said, her voice calm, almost too controlled. "And I'm pregnant." I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because my brain had short-circuited. "What?" She squeezed Mark's hand. He was taller than me, broad-shouldered, the kind of man you'd find on the cover of a fitness magazine. He had the decency to look uncomfortable, but not enough to let go of my wife. "I wanted you to hear it from me," she continued. "From us." My heartbeat pounded in my ears. "Us?" "Yes." She exhaled, as if I was the one making this difficult. "I love him, Daniel. And the baby is his." The words landed like a wrecking ball, shattering everything I thought I knew. "You love him?" My voice was barely above a whisper. "Yes." A silence settled, thick and suffocating. Then I noticed something. Something wrong. Emily's hand trembled, just slightly. Her gaze darted toward Mark before meeting mine again. Mark was too stiff, his fingers clenched at his sides. They weren't just breaking the news. They were afraid of something. I leaned forward, locking eyes with Emily. "Then why are you afraid?" Her breath hitched. Mark turned sharply, his jaw tightening. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said too quickly. But I did. Something wasn't right. Something else was going on, and I was going to find out what. I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms. "You're lying." Mark flinched, just barely, but I caught it. Emily's lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something but didn't dare. Her fingers curled against her stomach, a protective gesture. The room felt colder than it should have. I had two choices. Accept this ridiculous betrayal at face value, or dig deeper. I chose the latter. "You say you love him," I continued, my voice steady, "and that this is his child. Fine, but that's not the whole story, is it?" Emily swallowed hard. Mark took a step forward. "Look, man, I know this is hard." I held up a hand. "No, you don't." My eyes stayed on Emily. "You're scared, Em. I can see it. And not because you think I'll lash out." She stiffened. "You're scared because something else is going on." I stood, stepping closer, my tone sharpening. "So why don't we cut the act? Tell me the real reason you brought him here tonight." Emily inhaled sharply. Her eyes flicked to Mark again, almost as if she were waiting for his permission. That's when I knew. This wasn't her choice. Mark wasn't just some new lover sweeping her away. He was something else, something worse. I turned my attention to him. "How long have you been seeing my wife?" His jaw clenched. 2 years. Emily looked down. I exhaled, slow and measured. 2 years. That hurt. But I wasn't here to bleed over the past. I was here to understand what the hell was really happening. And this baby... "You're sure it's yours?" I pressed. Mark frowned. "Of course it's mine." A long silence stretched between us. Then I smiled. "No, it's not," Emily gasped. Mark's face darkened. "What the hell are you talking about?" I walked toward the small bar cart in the corner of the room, grabbing a bottle of whiskey, pouring myself a drink. Took a slow sip. Then I turned back to them, setting the glass down with a deliberate clink. "I had a vasectomy last year." Emily's breath hitched. Mark's eyes widened. "I never told you because we were already struggling," I continued, my voice calm but razor sharp. "I thought if you knew, it would break you. But now, I realize you were already broken." Emily took a step back, shaking her head. "No, that's not possible." It's more than possible, I said, crossing my arms. It's fact, which means one of two things. Either you were already pregnant before you met Mark, or you're lying to both of us. Mark turned to her, his face a storm of emotions. Emily? She stammered, her eyes darting wildly. No, I don't. Then the front door rattled, a sharp, precise knock, 3 times. Mark stiffened immediately. Emily went pale. I set my drink down. Expecting someone? Neither of them answered. I walked toward the door, but before I could reach it, Emily grabbed my wrist. Don't! Her voice was barely a whisper. My blood turned cold, because in that moment I realized this wasn't about a love affair. It was something far, far worse, and I had just walked into the middle of it. The knocking came again. 3 slow, deliberate thuds. I could feel Emily's fingers digging into my wrist, trembling. "Who is it?" I asked, my voice low. She didn't answer, neither did Mark. I yanked my arm free and took a step forward. "If I don't open it, they're going to keep knocking." Emily's eyes darted to Mark, who shook his head almost imperceptibly. His face had lost all its smugness. He wasn't just uncomfortable anymore. He was afraid. That made 2 of us. But fear wasn't going to stop me. I unlocked the door and pulled it open. A man stood on my doorstep, tall, dressed in a dark suit, his salt and pepper hair slicked back. Sharp features, piercing gray eyes. He didn't look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked mildly amused. "Daniel Green," he said smoothly, his voice rich like an expensive cigar. "Pleasure to finally meet you." Finally? I glanced over my shoulder. Emily had backed up against the wall, her breathing uneven. Mark's hands had curled into fists. Something about this felt staged, planned, like I had been led to this exact moment. I turned back to the man. "Who the hell are you?" He smiled, slow and deliberate. Then, ignoring my question, he took a single step forward. "Congratulations," he said. "You're going to be a father." My blood ran ice cold. I felt Emily's gasp behind me. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. He just looked at Emily. She was shaking her head, tears brimming in her eyes. No, you said it would be his. You said he wouldn't have to know." The man gave her a patient smile. "Plans change." I looked between them, my mind spinning. The baby wasn't Mark's. It wasn't mine either. Then whose was it? "What the hell is going on?" I demanded. The man in the suit stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He reached into his jacket, not for a weapon, but for something else. A small black envelope. He handed it to me. I hesitated, then tore it open. Inside was a single ultrasound photo, and beneath it, in bold letters, "Property of Dr. Elias Vorst." Genesis Biotech. My stomach turned. I knew that name. Dr. Vorst. The same scientist who had been making headlines for his ethically questionable fertility experiments. The one accused of using unapproved genetic modifications. The one who had disappeared 6 months ago, right before the government could shut his lab down. The man in the suit watched me, his gray eyes gleaming. "You should sit down, Daniel." I didn't. I couldn't. My wife's pregnancy wasn't an accident. It wasn't even natural. It was an experiment, and I was right in the middle of it. "Do you want to know the truth? Because it only gets darker from here." I gripped the ultrasound photo so tightly, it crumpled in my fist. My pulse roared in my ears. Mark still looked stunned, his mouth opening and closing like a man trying to wake from a nightmare. Emily, however, she wasn't just scared. She was broken. "Tell me," I said, my voice razor sharp, "what the hell this is?" The man in the suit, who still hadn't given his name, sighed, as if this conversation was a formality. "It's exactly what it looks like. The child your wife is carrying is no ordinary baby." I took a slow, controlled breath. "Whose is it?" Emily choked back a sob. Mark had gone pale. The man smiled. "A better question would be, What is it? The room seemed to tilt. I felt like the ground was slipping beneath me. I turned to Emily, my voice barely above a whisper. Did you know? Tears slipped down her cheeks. She didn't answer. That was an answer. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to make sense of it. You... what? Volunteered for some underground science project? She didn't volunteer, the man said smoothly. She was chosen. I turned sharply. By who? Now he smiled wider, like a magician about to reveal the final trick. By you. The words hit like a punch to the gut. What? The man gestured toward the couch, but I didn't move. You were flagged as a genetic outlier, Daniel. A perfect candidate. Strong immune system, high cognitive potential, and most importantly, his eyes gleamed. Predictable loyalty. My blood turned to ice. We knew you would never leave her, not even when things got complicated. I wanted to call him a liar, but deep down I knew. He was right. Even now, with my world crumbling, I hadn't stormed out, hadn't screamed, hadn't even considered walking away. They had studied me, profiled me. I turned back to Emily. When did you know? She wrapped her arms around herself, shaking. Not at first. They told me it was a new fertility treatment, something to increase our chances. I thought... Her voice cracked. I thought it was for us, Danny. I wanted to believe her, but I didn't. Not fully. I looked back at the man in the suit. And what about Mark? Mark flinched at his name, as if he'd been trying to disappear. The man smirked. A red herring. Mark's head snapped up. Wait, what? The man chuckled. Oh, don't look so hurt. You were useful. Someone to create doubt. To keep Daniel occupied while the real work happened. Mark looked like he might be sick. So what now? I asked, my voice eerily calm. The man's gray eyes locked onto mine. Now, he said, we wait. In a few months, she'll give birth to something the world has never seen before. Emily let out a quiet sob. And you? I pressed. What happens to me? The man's smile never wavered. Well, that depends on you, Daniel. A long silence. Then, for the first time, I smiled too. Yeah, I murmured. I figured as much. And then I grabbed the whiskey, glass, and smashed it against his head. The moment it shattered, Mark lunged at him too. Emily screamed. The man staggered back, stunned but not unconscious. Blood trickled down his temple. I grabbed Emily's wrist and ran. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. This was survival. And I was going to find out the truth on my terms. Do you want to know what happens next? Because this conspiracy is only beginning. Emily stumbled beside me as we bolted down the hall. My mind was a storm of adrenaline, rage, and a sickening realization. I had been played. For how long? By whom? And more importantly, why? Behind us, the suited man let out a dark chuckle, wiping blood from his forehead. You really think you can run from this, Daniel? I didn't answer. I yanked the front door open and dragged Emily out into the night. Mark was right behind us. For a second, I considered slamming the door and leaving him to deal with the man inside. But something in my gut told me he was just as much a pawn as I was. The three of us sprinted toward my car. I barely had time to get the key in the ignition before headlights flared to life in front of us, a black SUV, then another. Both vehicles blocked the street like a pair of wolves corralling their prey, Emily's. Breath hitched. Oh, God. Mark slammed his fist on the dashboard. They were waiting for us. Of course they were. This wasn't some last-minute operation. It had been orchestrated from the beginning. I had two choices, fight or run. No, I had one choice. Threw the car into reverse, slamming the gas pedal. The tires screeched as we rocketed backward down the street. The SUV's doors flew open. Figures in black spilled out, moving fast, too fast. I twisted the wheel, cutting into a side street. The tires skidded. Emily let out a strangled gasp as the car nearly clipped a mailbox. Mark braced against the dashboard, cursing under his breath. The SUVs weren't just following us. They were hurting us. I took another turn, then another. My mind worked faster than my hands, calculating escape routes, dead ends, where the nearest police station was, and then I saw it. A lone car at a stop sign. A blue sedan, driven by a man who was staring right at me. Recognition slammed into me like a freight train. Dr. Elias Vorst, the architect of this nightmare. I had never met him in person, but I'd seen his face on news articles, in old reports about his biotech work before he disappeared into the shadows. He wasn't running, he wasn't even trying to hide, he was waiting. For me, for the child. My stomach twisted. I gritted my teeth and swerved left, avoiding his car entirely. I didn't know what was waiting for me at the end of this road, but one thing was certain. I wasn't going to let them win, not without a fight. Do you want to know what happens next? Because the hunt has only begun. I sped down the darkened street, the needle on the speedometer creeping higher as the SUV's headlights loomed in the rearview mirror. Emily clutched the door handle, her breath shallow. Mark, knuckles white, was gripping the dashboard like it might save him. And behind us? Them. Not cops. Not some jealous lover, but a team of people who had been watching us for God knows how long. A team that worked for Dr. Elias Vorst, the man who had orchestrated everything, from Emily's pregnancy to the moment I realized my life was no longer mine. I wasn't just a man escaping a betrayal anymore. I was the key to something far, far bigger. The roadblock, Daniel. Watch out! Emily's scream yanked me back into the present. Up ahead, another black SUV swerved sideways across the road. A barricade. Too fast. No time to stop. I yanked the wheel. The car lurched to the right, tires screaming as we skidded onto a side street. I barely missed slamming into a row of parked cars. A sharp bang rang out, followed by another. Gunfire. They're shooting at us? Mark bellowed. I didn't answer. I floored the gas pedal, weaving through the streets. My heart slammed against my ribs. I couldn't lead them back to my house, couldn't go anywhere familiar. We needed to disappear. A desperate gamble. Emily suddenly grabbed my arm. "Daniel, stop the car!" I glanced at her like she'd lost her mind. "What? Are you insane? They'll—" "Trust me." She begged. I didn't, but I slowed just enough for her to throw the door open. She leaped out, hitting the pavement hard. What the hell? Before I could finish, Mark jumped too. I slammed the brakes, skidding to a stop. The two of them rolled into a ditch by the road, out of sight. The SUVs? They kept following me. I didn't even have time to process the betrayal. I hit the gas again and tore off into the night, leaving Emily and Mark behind. The last Cali didn't stop until I was deep into the outskirts of town, in an abandoned industrial park. Only then did I pull out my phone. My hands were shaking. I dialed Emily. She answered on the first ring. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "We had to split up. They weren't going to stop if they thought you still had me." I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. "So what now?" Silence. Then she said, "You have to find Vorst before they do." My stomach dropped. "What? They don't just want the baby, Daniel. They want you." Her voice was raw, terrified. "Find him first, before they take you too." A rustling sound. Then, the line went dead. And just like that, I was alone. No wife, no friend. No one to trust. Just a target on my back and a single terrifying truth. If I didn't find Dr. Vorst first, I wasn't going to live long enough to see how this story ended. Do you want to know what happens next? Because I promise you the real nightmare has only begun. The hunt for Vorst. I sat in the silence of my car, my breath steady but my mind racing. Emily was gone. Mark was gone. And now, for reasons I didn't fully understand, I was the one they wanted. I gripped the steering wheel. If I wanted to survive, I had to do two things. Find Dr. Vorst before they did. Figure out why the hell I was so important. I checked my phone again. No messages. No signal. I wasn't surprised. If these people could orchestrate an entire pregnancy without my knowledge, they sure as hell could block a phone signal. I needed an actual lead. And I had one. The missing scientist. Before he went underground, Dr. Elias Vorst was a rising star in biotech. He'd made headlines for his controversial research on genetic enhancement, but after a government crackdown, his lab was raided. They found nothing. No research, no files, no Vorst. He disappeared like a ghost, but ghosts always leave shadows, and I knew exactly where to look. The old facility. 30 minutes later, I pulled up to a rusted chain-link fence. Beyond it stood the remains of Vorst's old lab. The place had been abandoned for months. The windows were shattered. The sign out front had been burned, the words barely visible. Genesis Biotechy cut the engine, sat in the dark, no movement. No signs of life, but something about the place felt wrong, like it wasn't truly abandoned. I checked my glove box, found a rusted old crowbar. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Then I stepped out into the cold night. Not alone. Inside, the lab was exactly what I expected. Empty, stripped down, left to rot. But there were footprints in the dust, recent ones. I gripped the crowbar tighter. I wasn't alone. A noise, a scrape from somewhere deeper inside. I pressed forward, careful. Silent. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, but I ignored it. Then I saw it, a single light, glowing beneath a door at the end of the hall. Someone was in there. I raised the crowbar, stepped forward, and then the door swung open. A man stood in the doorway, tall, thin, wisps of white hair, deep-set eyes that had seen far too much. I knew that face. Dr. Elias Vorst. He stared at me for a long moment. Then, finally, he spoke. "I was wondering when you'd find me, Daniel." I froze. "How do you know my name?" Vorst smiled. "Because," he said, stepping aside, "this all started with you. Do you want to step inside? Because the real answers are waiting. The truth behind the experiment." I stood in the doorway, staring at Dr. Elias Vorst, the man who had somehow orchestrated my wife's pregnancy, the one who had vanished months ago without a trace. Now, here he was, waiting for me, my grip on the crowbar tightened. "You're going to tell me everything." Vorst gave me a small, almost amused smile. "Of course, Daniel. That's why you're here." He turned and walked into the dimly lit room. For a split second, I debated running. But then I followed him inside. The door shut behind me. The project. The room was filled with old lab equipment, most of it broken or dismantled. But in the center stood a single metal table. On it, a thick file. Vorst gestured to it. "Go ahead. Read it." I hesitated, then picked it up. Inside were dozens of documents. My hands trembled as I flipped through them. My name was all over them. Stopped at a page labeled Subject D13, Primary Donor Profile Name, Daniel Green, Genetic Viability, High Cognitive Stability, High Psychological Resilience, Exceptional. My stomach turned. What the hell is this? Vorst leaned against the table. "You were chosen, Daniel, not randomly, not by accident. Your genetics, your entire bloodline, was selected for this project. Years ago." I shook my head. "That's impossible. I've never—" Vorst cut me off. "Tell me, Daniel, have you ever had unexplained gaps in your memory? Hours lost? Days?" A cold chill ran through me. I had. Small moments, here and there. A business trip where I woke up in my hotel room with no memory of how I got there. A night out where I lost. 6 hours. I had chalked it up to exhaustion. Stress, now, I wasn't so sure. Vorst nodded, seeing the realization on my face. You've been part of this for years, long before Emily's pregnancy, long before any of this started. I clenched my jaw. So what did you do to me? Vorst's expression darkened. Not just you, Daniel. He reached for another file. This one had a photo. A baby's ultrasound. My chest tightened. Emily's? Vorst shook his head. No, he slid the file toward me. This was taken 10 years ago. The first child. The room suddenly felt smaller, tighter. I picked up the ultrasound photo, my pulse hammering. The date in the corner was impossible. 2015. I swallowed. What are you saying? Vorst exhaled. You weren't the only one, Daniel. You were part of something much bigger. I looked back down at the file. Another document. Another name. Subject, D01. Primary donor name, Daniel Green. Status, successful birth child. Location, unknown. My blood turned to ice. I had a child I never knew existed. And now the people chasing me, the people hunting Emily's pregnancy, they had already taken the first one. I slammed the file down. Where is my child? Vorst met my gaze. I don't know, he said. But if you don't stop them, Daniel, they're going to take this one too. Do you want to know where this leads? Because now it's not just about survival, it's about getting my child back, the lost child. The world tilted. I stared at the file, my own name stamped across documents I had never seen, tied to a child I had never met, a child who was already gone. I looked at Dr. Vorst, my voice low, steady. You're telling me I have a kid out there, one I never knew about? Vorst nodded. I swallowed the anger rising in my throat. And you don't know where they are? For the first time, I saw something flicker in his expression. Regret. No, he admitted. Not anymore. I clenched my fists. Then start talking, because I swear to God, if you're lying to me, I'm not, he cut in. And if you want to save your wife and your unborn child, you need to listen. I exhaled sharply, forcing myself to calm down. Fine. Talk. Vorst nodded, gathering his thoughts. Then, in a voice eerily calm, he said, It all started with Project Eden, the experiment. 30 years ago, Vorst began, a classified program was launched under the guise of genetic research. The goal? To create a superior lineage. Humans with enhanced immunity, intelligence, and psychological resilience. I shook my head. That sounds like some Nazi eugenics bullshit. Vorst smirked. Not quite. This wasn't about breeding superiority. It was about engineering it. I frowned. What does that have to do with me? He tapped the file. You were one of the last subjects in the program, the result of 2 generations of genetic selection. I felt sick. So I'm... what? A lab rat? No. Vorst's eyes locked onto mine. You were the control. The words sent a cold chill through me. The first child, your first child, was part of the experiment, he continued. Born in secret, raised in controlled conditions. Then 5 years ago, the program went dark. The subject vanished. My stomach turned. They took my child, I said quietly. Vorst nodded. And now they're coming for the next one. The pursuers, I ran a hand down my face, trying to process it all. Who are they? Who's running this now? Vorst hesitated. Then he said a name that made my blood freeze. Gideon Langley. I looked up sharply. Langley, as in the defense contractor? Vorst's jaw tightened. The same. After the program collapsed, Langley's private firm bought out what was left of the research. He's been hunting the original test subjects ever since. I felt like the walls were closing in. That means... I swallowed. Emily's pregnancy wasn't just an accident, Vorst finished. It was activated. My mind reeled. Langley had planned this. He had engineered it, and now he was coming to claim what he saw as his property, Emily, The baby, my first child, a decade of my life. Stolen. No, I wasn't going to let them take anything else. I turned to Vorst. You said you lost track of my first child. That means you knew where they were before. A slow nod. Then we start there, I said. Give me everything you have, every name, every location. We find them, before Langley does. Vorst studied me. Then, for the first time, he looked, almost impressed. All right, Daniel, he said. Let's begin. The hunt is on. Next stop, the last known location of my missing child, and I'm not leaving without answers. The first lead, Dr. Vorst, didn't hesitate. He turned, opened a rusted filing cabinet, and pulled out a thin folder. Inside were faded documents, redacted reports, and a single grainy photograph. I picked it up. My stomach twisted. It was a child. No older than 10. Short, dark hair, a solemn expression, a boy, my son, a son. I never knew I had. I swallowed hard. Where was this taken? Vorst tapped a section of the report. Last known location. Greystone Academy, upstate New York. My pulse quickened. A school. A front, Vorst corrected. Greystone is a private institution, highly selective. Funded by shell corporations tied to Langley's defense firm. The children who go there, they aren't just students, I exhaled sharply. They're experiments, Vorst nodded grimly. Controlled environments, monitored progress. Until 5 years ago, when they shut it down. I frowned. Why? His expression darkened. Because one of the children escaped. A silence stretched between us. The realization hit like a gut punch. My son. Vorst nodded. Langley has been searching for him ever since. I looked back at the photograph, my grip tightening. If my son was out there, alone, hunted, then I had to find him first, and Greystone Academy was my only lead. The road to Greystone. Didn't waste time. Within an hour, I had what I needed, an old map, a burner phone, and the keys to a car that wasn't mine. Vorst wasn't coming with me. He had his own ways of staying hidden. But before I left, he gave me a final warning. Be careful, Daniel, he said. You're not the only one looking for him. I knew that. And I knew that once I started down this road, there was no turning back. A stranger in the night, the drive. To Greystone Academy took 6 hours. By the time I arrived, it was just past midnight. The school was abandoned, just as Vorst had said. A sprawling estate hidden deep in the woods, its wrought iron gates rusted shut. I parked down the road and approached on foot. The air was thick with the scent of pine, the night silent except for the distant chirp of crickets. Then, a sound, a rustling from beyond the gate. Someone was already here. I ducked low, creeping forward. A shadow moved between the trees. A figure. Tall. Hooded, moving fast. Not a guard, not a soldier, someone alone. I held my breath, watching. Then, just as the figure turned toward the moonlight, I saw his face. My chest tightened. It was him, my son. 10 years lost, now standing just a few feet away, but before I could move, a sudden crack echoed through the forest. A gunshot. The boy's eyes widened. Then he ran. I swore under my breath and sprinted after him. Because whoever had fired that shot, they weren't aiming at me. They were aiming at him, and I wasn't about to lose him again. The chase is on. My son is out there, and I'm not the only one hunting him. The chase I ran as fast as I could, adrenaline surging through my veins, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure of my son darted through the trees ahead of me, moving with an agility that told me he'd been running for a long time, long before. Tonight. The gunshot echoed in the night again, but I couldn't stop to look behind me. I had to keep him in sight. I wasn't the only one hunting him. There were others. I pushed through the thick underbrush, branches snapping in the darkness, my breath coming in sharp bursts. Then, just as I thought I'd lost him, I saw a blur of movement. He was crouched by an old stone wall, peering around the corner of a building. He was watching something, or someone. I slowed, my movements quiet as I approached. He didn't seem to notice me yet. I stopped a few feet away, catching my breath. "Hey!" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. The boy froze. Then he slowly turned his head toward me. For a moment, we just stared at each other. His face was younger, but there was something unmistakable about his features. The same eyes, the same jawline. He was mine, but he didn't speak. I took a step forward. "I'm your father." His eyes flickered with recognition, then fear. He stood up, backing away. "No, you're not. You're not real." I took another step. "I swear I am. My name is Daniel Green." His eyes darted toward the trees, as if considering running again, but something in my voice must have stopped him. He hesitated. "I'm not here to hurt you," I said softly. "I'm here to get you out, to get you away from all of this." He stared at me for a long moment, his breath shallow, but then crack. The sound of a branch snapping from behind us. I whipped around just in time to see a shadow emerge from the trees, a figure, tall, silent, and they weren't alone. Two others stepped forward, all wearing dark clothing and carrying rifles. The boy flinched, his body tensing. They'd found us. I instinctively stepped between him and the newcomers. "Stay behind me," I muttered under my breath. One of the figures stepped forward, raising his weapon slightly. "Get out of the way." His voice was gravelly, menacing. "No." My voice was firm. I wasn't going to let them take him again. "You don't have a choice." The man's tone grew colder. "He's ours." I felt a surge of anger. "You don't get to say that. He's not your property." The figure's eyes narrowed. Then, just as he was about to speak again, a different voice rang out from behind us. "Step aside." I turned, and for a split second, my heart dropped. "Mark." Mark was standing at the edge of the clearing, holding up his hands in a gesture of peace. But it wasn't the look on his face that made my heart stop. It was the way he was standing. The way his hands were barely visible behind his back, clutching something. "Mark, what the hell are you doing here?" I hissed, my mind racing. "I've been tracking you," Mark said, his voice calm. "You don't get it, Daniel. You're playing right into their hands." I glanced at the men in front of me. They weren't the same group I had seen earlier, the ones who had been chasing me down the highway. These were different. And then it hit me. Mark wasn't just here to help. He was one of them. I took a step back, heart sinking. "You're with them, aren't you?" Mark didn't answer. Instead, his eyes flickered to the boy behind me. A cold smile played at the corner of his mouth. "You've been chasing shadows, Daniel. He's not your son. He's part of something much bigger." I froze. The words didn't make sense. "What are you talking about?" Before Mark could respond, the leader of the armed group took another step forward. "Enough talk." The barrel of his rifle swung in my direction. This wasn't a negotiation. It wasn't a rescue. This was the moment they were going to end it all. "Do you want to know how it all ends? Because it's about to take a turn you won't see coming." The truth revealed. The barrel of the rifle aimed directly at my chest. Time seemed to slow. My heart was hammering in my throat, and the weight of everything crashing down on me felt suffocating. I glanced at Mark, standing there with that cold smile still on his face. But the words he had just spoken echoed in my mind. "He's not your son." The reality of it hit me like a punch to the gut. Mark was with them. Before I could react, I felt the boy's hand on my shoulder. His touch was light, but his grip was firm. "He's right," the boy said quietly. I froze. "What?" His face was shadowed. but there was a kind of understanding in his eyes that I didn't want to believe. He stepped out from behind me, facing me for the first time. "I'm not your son, Daniel." A sharp breath escaped my lungs. "It couldn't be." "You're lying," I said, my voice hoarse. "You look like me. I know you're my son. I know it." But the boy didn't flinch. Instead, he seemed almost resigned, like he was tired of carrying a weight that was far too heavy for him to bear. He looked at Mark. Then he looked back at me. "You're not the first one," he said softly. "They've been using people like you for years." His eyes shifted to the armed men who were silently watching the exchange. "They don't care about the children. They don't care about you. You're just another test subject, just like my real father, just like the others." A chill crawled down my spine. Mark's face was emotionless as he stepped forward. "The project was never about your son, Daniel. It was about you." I stared at him, my heart pounding in disbelief. "Me?" Mark's lips curled into a thin smile. "You were always the key. You and your bloodline. The children, the experiments, they're all just vessels, tools to unlock what's inside you." I blinked, trying to piece the fragments together. "What are you talking about? What's inside me?" Mark's voice dropped to a whisper. "You've been carrying it all along. The genetic blueprint for the next phase of human evolution. They were trying to unlock it for decades. Your genetics, your DNA." I felt lightheaded, like the ground was pulling away beneath me. "No, I'm not special. I'm just me. Just some guy who got caught in a messed up situation." Mark shook his head slowly. "You've always been more than that. And they know it. That's why they want you. And your children. The unthinkable." I turned to the boy, desperate for some kind of clarity. "Then why do you look like me? Why have you been running all this time?" The boy hesitated, glancing at the armed men who stood silently behind Mark. Finally, he spoke. "They were trying to make more of you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "They were trying to create a whole new generation of people with the potential you have. But it wasn't perfect, not like they hoped. They made mistakes. I'm one of those mistakes." A wave of realization crashed over me. He wasn't my son. He was one of the failed experiments, a product of the same twisted project. A project that had started years ago with me. "And you're not the only one, Daniel," Mark added. "You have a family, many families out there, children just like him. They're scattered across the world now, hidden from the world, and we're all part of the same thing." I stepped back, trying to absorb the enormity of it all. "You've been working for them all along. All these years you were never my friend, Mark. You were part of the experiment." Mark's face remained impassive. "It's not like that. Not anymore. The project changed. Langley doesn't care about you anymore, Daniel. He wants to control the power that's inside of you. And once he does, everything will change. There won't be any normal people left. Just us." I felt the walls closing in, the air getting heavier with every word Mark spoke. This was bigger than I ever could have imagined, but I had no more time for questions. The decision. I glanced back at the boy, the child I thought was mine, the one who had been caught in the middle of this monstrous web. There was something almost tragic in his expression, as though he knew he was just a pawn in a much larger game. I turned my gaze back to Mark. "What do you want, Mark? What's your end game?" He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes. "I want you to join us. Help us unlock what's inside of you. The world as you know it is over, Daniel. The power we can control is limitless. And once we've done what we need, we can all step into a new world." I shook my head. "You're insane. You're asking me to side with the very people who stole my life." Mark took a step forward. "And you think you have a choice?" I stepped back, my mind racing. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It wasn't about getting answers. It was about survival. I had a choice, but it wasn't easy. Mark raised his rifle slightly. "Step aside, Daniel. They're coming, and once they do, there's no going back." But as he said the words, I felt the ground shift beneath my feet. A sound. A low hum. Something was approaching. The arrival. The helicopter hovered above us, its spotlight blinding in the darkness. The roar of its engines was deafening, and the wind it stirred swept through the trees like a violent storm. But amidst the chaos, one thing became clear. This wasn't just another force sent by Langley. The men in dark uniforms, the ones who had been chasing me, flinched at the sight of it, their rifles lowering instinctively. Mark's face twisted in disbelief as he took a step back. He was nervous. And that was when I knew. Whoever was coming for us, they weren't allies of Langley. The helicopter touched down, kicking up dirt and debris. Its door slid open with a mechanical hiss, and out stepped a woman dressed in dark, tactical gear, a black mask obscuring most of her face. The strange thing, though, was the silence that accompanied her movement. No boots pounding, no heavy breathing, just cold, controlled precision. She was unlike anyone I had seen in years. The armed men stood frozen for a moment, uncertain. Mark, however, took a step toward her, his posture defensive but strangely respectful. He must have known her. I took the opportunity to pull the boy a little further behind me, keeping my eyes fixed on the strange new arrivals. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The woman spoke first, her voice calm but powerful. "Step away from the subject," she commanded. Her gaze flicked to Mark. "This experiment has gone far beyond your control. We've been watching you. Now, we take over." Mark's eyes darkened. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over?" She didn't answer him directly. Instead, her gaze shifted to me, and something flickered in her eyes. A recognition? Something more than just professional curiosity? Her voice softened slightly, but still carried the same cold edge. "Daniel Green, I never expected to see you here, but I guess fate works in strange ways." The mention of my name struck me like a punch to the gut. "You know who I am," I said, my voice thick with suspicion. "Who the hell are you?" She gave a tight smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm someone who's been tracking your movements for a long time. I've been trying to stop Langley from getting his hands on you, on your bloodline, before it's too late." Her words hit me like a brick. "Stop Langley? You're not with him?" She shook her head slowly. "Langley isn't the threat. Not anymore." She paused, her voice dropping lower, quieter, almost conspiratorial. "We are." The confusion hit me like a flood. "Wait, what?" Her eyes flickered to the boy behind me. "The child you've been chasing isn't a mistake. He's part of a much bigger plan, a plan you were always meant to be a part of." I felt my head spin. This doesn't make any sense." "Let me clarify," she continued. "The project was never about creating some superhuman race, Daniel. It was always about unlocking something inside of you, and others like you. The children, the so-called experiments, they were the vehicles, the tools. But the true power has always been you." I looked at her, the fog beginning to clear, but still not fully understanding. "What do you mean, the true power? What are you talking about?" She gave a half smile, one filled with bitter knowledge. "You've felt it, haven't you? The pull, the power that's been inside you, just beneath the surface. That's what Langley was trying to exploit, to control. They couldn't quite get it right. But we can." I felt a wave of nausea. "You're talking about me?" She nodded. "You were part of something much bigger than you could ever imagine. The children, they're a link, a connection. But the real key? It's you." The choice. Before I could process her words, a flash of movement caught my eye. One of the armed men, perhaps the leader, raised his rifle once again, aiming directly at the boy standing behind me. No! I shouted, my instincts kicking in. I stepped in front of the boy just as the rifle's barrel was about to fire. But the woman was faster. In one fluid motion, she unsheathed a sleek, silver pistol from her side and shot the armed man before he could squeeze the trigger. The shot echoed through the night, and the man collapsed, his weapon clattering to the ground. The others, stunned and momentarily frozen, didn't dare to move. I looked at the woman, my heart racing. "Why did you do that?" She didn't answer right away, her gaze fixed on the remaining soldiers. They seemed unsure whether to take another shot or retreat. But she turned back to me, her voice steady. "Because we can't risk another failure." She looked pointedly at Mark. "And this time, Daniel, you get to choose." "Choose?" I asked, my mind racing. "Choose what?" "Choose whether you're going to continue to let people like Langley and Mark manipulate you," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "Or whether you'll stand with us and take control of your future. The power inside you is too dangerous to be left unchecked. And if Langley gets to it first..." The decision, I stood frozen, caught between two worlds, two sides of a story that I still didn't fully understand. The woman's words echoed in my head like a drum beat. You get to choose. But what exactly was the choice? The boy behind me, the one I thought was my son, stood still, his eyes wide, reflecting the same confusion I felt. I could see the fear in his gaze, the uncertainty of what it would mean for his future if I made the wrong choice. And then there was Mark. His expression, unreadable, cold, but still desperate for something. Power? Control? Or was he genuinely trying to protect me or perhaps use me for his own gains? My breath felt heavy in my chest. The helicopter's engine thrummed above us, still hanging in the air as though waiting for something, waiting for me to decide. "Daniel," Mark said suddenly, his voice lower than before. He was no longer the ally I thought he was, and yet I could hear the urgency in his tone. "You don't understand. You think Langley is the enemy? You think these people are going to help you? They're just as bad. They want the same thing." The woman stepped forward, cutting Mark off with a sharp look. "We're not Langley," she said, her voice now full of authority. "Langley's been manipulating you, using your bloodline for his own agenda. You've been nothing more than a tool in his game, Daniel. But we are different. We want to free you from his control. We want to use the power inside you to reshape the world." She paused for a moment, her eyes locking onto mine with an intensity I couldn't ignore. "You can help us bring about the change the world desperately needs. Or you can stand with people like him," she gestured toward Mark, "who would keep the world chained to the same old mistakes." I looked at Mark, who had stepped forward again, his eyes desperate. "Don't listen to her, Daniel. I didn't ask for this either. I was just trying to get to you before they did. You don't understand what they'll do to you. They'll control you, manipulate you. They'll use you to create more of those experiments, more children, more power. That's all this is about, power." The boy behind me shifted his weight, his hand tightening into a fist. I could see it in his eyes. He was tired of being used, tired of running, tired of being a pawn in a game he never asked to play. But he too was waiting for me to make the first move. And then I realized this wasn't just about me. It was about all of us. About the boy. About Mark. About the world that had been slowly falling apart because of the choices made long before any of us were born. The moment of truth. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every word, every decision that had brought me here. The woman had said we had the power to reshape the world. But at what cost? Could I really trust her? Could I trust anyone? But there was something in her eyes, something that resonated deep within me. She wasn't lying. She wasn't just looking to control me like Langley had. She believed in the change she spoke of, and perhaps, just perhaps, she wasn't lying about the power inside me. I turned back to Mark, my voice steady. You keep talking about power, Mark, but you've never said what you want. You want control, don't you? You want to be the one who holds the reins. His jaw clenched. I'm trying to stop this from going too far, Daniel. I shook my head. But you're just as much a part of the problem as Langley. You think you're helping, but you're just keeping the cycle going. You've made your choice, and now I'm making mine. I turned to the woman. I don't know if I can trust you, but I know I can't trust him. For a moment, she said nothing, her gaze softening slightly, as though she hadn't expected that response. Then, with a small nod, she gave me a brief but respectful smile. You've made the right choice. Without another word, she signaled to the soldiers who had been silently waiting by the helicopter. They immediately started moving, swiftly securing the perimeter, but Mark wasn't ready to give up just yet. He lunged forward, his hand reaching for the weapon at his side. The woman was faster. In a fluid motion, she drew a dart gun from her hip and fired. The tranquilizer dart hit Mark in the neck, and he dropped to the ground, unconscious before he even hit the dirt. I watched him fall, a cold sense of finality washing over me. Mark was no longer my problem. The boy behind me stepped forward, finally looking me directly in the eyes. He was no longer a stranger, no longer someone I had to protect. He was part of the bigger picture. And now, I realized, he was one of the keys to this new world. The woman looked at me. We need to move quickly. There's much more we need to explain, but time is running out. Langley will not give up. He will come for you. He will come for all of us. I nodded, suddenly feeling the weight of what was to come. But for the first time since I'd entered this nightmare, I felt like I finally had a purpose. The road ahead. The hum of the helicopter's engines was a constant companion as we took off, leaving the clearing behind us, the faint outline of Mark's unconscious form fading into the distance. The weight of my decision sat heavily on my shoulders, but a strange calm had settled over me. The world I had known, the world where I was just an ordinary man, was gone. The old rules no longer applied, and maybe, just maybe, that was for the best. The woman, who still hadn't introduced herself, sat in the seat across from me, her eyes locked on the horizon, scanning the terrain below. The boy, who I now knew wasn't my son, but also wasn't entirely a stranger, sat beside me, silent, his hands folded in his lap. His face was a mixture of uncertainty and something else. Maybe hope? It was hard to tell, but one thing was clear. He was just as much a part of this new world as I was. And that thought in itself terrified me. After a long silence, the woman finally spoke. You should know, Daniel, that what we're about to do isn't simple. The people who will come after us won't stop. Langley's reach is vast, but if we're to succeed in what we've planned, we'll need more than just the two of us. I glanced at the boy beside me. What do you mean? What's the plan? Where are we going? My voice was thick with uncertainty, but also with a spark of something else, curiosity. She exhaled slowly, her gaze never leaving the horizon. We're heading to a place called the Haven. It's not a city, not a military base, and certainly not a sanctuary. It's something different. A place where we've been gathering those like you, those with the potential to change everything. Children, experiments, people who were never meant to exist according to Langley's twisted plan. She turned to meet my eyes, her expression serious. People who were never meant to be anything but tools. My mind reeled with the implications of what she was saying. A haven for people like me? How many others were there? And what exactly did that mean for the world I once knew? What's the point of all this? What's the haven really for? I asked, my voice rising with a mix of disbelief and apprehension. The woman's lips curled into a tight smile. It's a place to rebuild, Daniel, a place to teach people like you, like him, she motioned toward the boy, to control what's inside them, to unlock it. You're not just a genetic anomaly, Daniel. You're the key to something greater. And the boy? I asked, feeling an odd protective instinct rise up. What's his role in all of this? Her smile faltered slightly, but she didn't look away. The boy is part of the evolution. He's not like you. Not exactly. But his power, it's connected to yours. Together, you'll help us understand how to unlock the next stage of human evolution. We've spent years studying this, but we need you both to push us forward. We need you to help us. I glanced at the boy. His eyes were locked on me now, and for the first time, I noticed the faint glow in his irises, almost like a hint of light trying to break free from the shadows. I swallowed, trying to steady myself. This wasn't just about me anymore. The weight of this responsibility, of what was at stake, was pressing down on me harder than I ever expected, but I had already made my choice. We're running from Langley, but what are we running toward? I asked, almost to myself. The woman leaned back in her seat, her expression grim but determined. Toward a world where we control our own fate. A world where we decide the future, not men like Langley, who think they can use people like you for their own twisted experiments. And when we get there, what then? I asked. What happens to all the power we're supposed to unlock? Her eyes flashed with something sharp, something dangerous. Then we fight back, Daniel. We don't just sit and wait, we use it. We shape it, and we change everything. The Haven. The journey felt like it stretched on forever, but eventually the helicopter began its descent. Below us, I could see a sprawling facility hidden deep in the mountains, nestled between jagged cliffs and thick forests. It was a place that seemed almost otherworldly, a place that had been carved out from the wilderness itself. As we touched down, I could see the guards waiting by the perimeter, armed and alert, but unlike the ones I had seen before, these were different. There was a calm about them, like they weren't just soldiers, but part of something far bigger. I stepped out of the helicopter, the cool mountain air biting at my skin. The boy followed. Me, his footsteps light but determined. The woman stepped down after us, her presence commanding. "We're here," she said softly, turning toward me. "This is where the real work begins." I glanced around, my mind buzzing with 1,000 questions. And what do we do now? The woman's gaze softened for a moment before she answered. We teach, we learn, and we prepare. Langley will come for us, Daniel. But by the time he does, the awakening. The heavy doors of the Haven sealed shut behind us with an ominous thud, and the air around us seemed to shift, charged with a quiet energy. The walls of the compound were constructed from reinforced steel and concrete. Yet there was something almost organic about the place, as if it had grown into the earth itself, hidden from prying eyes for decades. The sheer remoteness of it, isolated in the mountains, surrounded by trees, far from civilization, made it feel like the last bastion of something ancient, a secret meant to remain buried. I took in the sight of the place, a sprawling network of buildings, each one functional but eerily sterile. There were no signs, no markings, no indication of the kind of place I had just entered. The people here walked with purpose, their eyes locked forward, focused, like they had been trained to live in this space from the moment they were born. And then there was the boy. He stood beside me, just a few paces away, his hands still folded, neatly in front of him, his expression unreadable. But there was a faint tension in his posture, a readiness to move, to react at any given moment. The same way I felt, but perhaps even more so. I couldn't help but wonder what kind of life he had led before this. What kind of training had shaped him? The woman, who still hadn't given me her name, turned to face me. Her voice was calm, but there was an edge to it now. This is where we will begin. It's a training ground for those like you. Like him. She motioned toward the boy. It's where you'll learn to control your abilities, and where you'll begin to understand why Langley feared this day. She paused for a moment, scanning my face. You'll see the truth soon enough, Daniel. But for now, we need to move quickly. We don't have much time. I looked at her, confusion swirling inside me. What do you mean, the truth? And why didn't you just tell me what this place really is? Who are you? She gave me a tight smile. I'll explain everything, Daniel, but you have to trust me. Trust that. We're on the same side now. She glanced at the boy again, a flicker of something, concern maybe, crossing her face. Let's just say, Langley's vision was never the full picture. This place will help you understand why. I took a deep breath, still processing everything she had told me. I couldn't afford to be naive anymore, not after everything I had seen. My life had been turned upside down, and now I was expected to be part of a new world, a world where power was the currency and secrets were the rule. I turned to the boy and noticed he was no longer just standing there, looking lost. He was watching me closely, his eyes sharp and calculating, as if studying me just as much as I was studying him. In that moment, I realized he knew something. Something I didn't. Who are you? I asked quietly, more to myself than anyone else. But the boy's eyes locked onto mine, and he answered in a voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, but I think you're the key. The words sent a shiver down my spine. The key? To what? To the future? To the power the woman had spoken about? The weight of his words felt like they carried the entire burden of this twisted, fractured world on his shoulders. The first trial, we walked deeper into the compound, and I could feel the eyes of those around us, eyes that were both cautious and curious, as if they knew something about me that I didn't. It was unsettling. Every hallway we passed seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't explain, the walls lined with strange symbols and diagrams that made no sense. There was a science to this place, a science far beyond anything I had encountered. We entered a large, windowless room, the walls humming with an unnatural buzz. In the center stood a pedestal, and on it, a strange device. It was sleek, metallic, and connected to an array of cables and wires that seemed to glow faintly in the low light. This is where it all starts, the woman said, her voice quiet but heavy with meaning. This device will help you unlock your potential. It will help you understand what you've been running from. She turned to face me fully, her eyes narrowing. But before we proceed, you need to understand something important, Daniel. You are not the first to undergo this transformation. There have been others, people like you, who were born with the same genetic code. Some were successful, others failed. But they all had one thing in common. She hesitated for a moment, and then, almost as if she were sharing a dark secret, added, The power you carry inside you is alive. It's a force, and it can't be controlled without sacrifice. I swallowed hard. Sacrifice. It was always the price of power, wasn't it? The price of knowledge, the price of control. The boy moved closer to the pedestal, his gaze fixed on the device with a kind of quiet reverence. There was something about the way he looked at it, something almost otherworldly, like he had seen it before. The crucible. The surge of energy intensified, and I felt as though I were being torn apart from the inside out. The world around me, no, the very fabric of reality itself, seemed to flicker and distort. For a split second, I wondered if I had made a grave mistake. The sacrifice the woman had mentioned. Was I going to lose myself in this process? Would I emerge from this transformation as something unrecognizable, a vessel for the power that now raged within me? I clenched my fists, fighting against the overwhelming sensation, the flood of power threatening to overwhelm my mind. It was like being submerged in a storm, the waves crashing over me, trying to pull me under. But then, in the chaos, a calm voice reached me, a voice I recognized instantly. "You're not alone." It was the boy. His words grounded me, pulling me back from the edge of panic. I focused on him, allowing the calm in his voice to wash over me like a gentle wave. Somehow, even though I barely knew him, I trusted him. His presence, his calm, was like a lifeline, a steady anchor in the midst of the storm. "You can do this. Trust yourself. Trust us," he said, his words like a mantra that kept repeating in my mind. I focused on his voice, allowing it to guide me, to anchor me in this chaotic moment. Slowly, painfully, I began to regain control. The energy inside me, which had been so wild and untamed, started to become something I could harness. It was still there, still thrumming through me, but now it was mine to command. The images I had seen, the visions, began to clarify. I saw people, places, events that had never happened but felt like memories, a deep ancestral connection to everything that was unfolding. I could feel their power too, the others, the ones who had come before me, the ones who had tried to unlock this same potential. Some had succeeded, others had failed, consumed by the very force I was grappling with now. But I was different. I could feel it. I was ready. With a final surge, the energy inside me coalesced, settling into a steady rhythm that hummed through my veins like a second heartbeat. The chaos in my mind calmed, and I opened my eyes. The world around me came back, into focus. The boy stood in front of me, his gaze steady, but now there was a faint trace of something else. Relief? Pride? "You did it," he said quietly. "You're ready." The decision of power. The woman stepped forward, her expression unreadable but somehow knowing. "It's done," she said, her voice low and thoughtful. "But this is only the beginning. You've unlocked the first layer of your potential, Daniel, but there are many more layers to uncover. Each one will be harder, more dangerous, and each one will require a choice." I looked at her, my mind still reeling from the overwhelming rush of power. "A choice?" I repeated. "What kind of choice?" She stepped closer, her eyes sharp as though studying me with a new intensity. "The more power you unlock, the more influence you'll have over the world. And as with any power, you'll have to decide how you use it, who you use it for." My mind flashed to Langley, the shadowy figure who had been manipulating everything from the start. He wanted the power I had now, and he would stop at nothing to take it from me. "What happens if I refuse to use this power?" I asked, my voice steady despite the storm brewing inside me. "What happens if I just walk away?" Her eyes darkened slightly. "You can try, but Langley won't let you go. He will come for you, and when he does, he will take it from you by force. You've seen what he's capable of. You've seen what he's done." I clenched my jaw, the images of the experiments, the children, the fear. It had all been part of Langley's plan. He had never cared about the people, only the power they could give him. "You're asking me to take this power, to use it against him." "Against everything he's built," I said slowly, piecing it together. "But what if this power changes me? What if I become like him?" The woman shook her head. "No, you're not like him. You're not a product of manipulation. You're the antithesis of everything he stands for. You're a force of change, of possibility. You're not a weapon, you're a choice, the choice the world needs." I glanced at the boy who stood beside me, his expression unreadable but his presence unmistakably supportive. We were in this together, but the weight of it all, the power I now carried, the responsibility, it felt like too much. Then what's the plan? I asked, my voice tinged with frustration. What do we do now? What's the next step? The woman's gaze softened. We prepare. We gather those like you, like the boy. We find the others who are ready to join us. We form an army, not of soldiers, but of individuals who can reshape the world with their gifts. The haven was just the beginning. We need to reach out. I shook my head. And then what? We fight back against Langley and his army? And what if we fail? The gathering storm. The days passed like a blur. Each one was filled with intense training, uncovering secrets, and preparing for the war that would inevitably come. The air in the haven seemed to hum with purpose, an undercurrent of anticipation that no one dared voice aloud. We all knew what was at stake, and as the days turned into weeks, the weight of the upcoming battle pressed down on every single person in the compound. I had never imagined myself as a soldier, but now I was training to lead one of the most important rebellions in history. The boy, whose name, I had learned, was Aiden, was by my side through it all, his calm presence a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts and emotions swirling in my mind. Aiden had become not just a comrade, but a friend, in the truest sense of the word. Together, we were learning to control our newfound abilities, pushing the boundaries of what we had once thought possible. One evening, after a particularly grueling training session, I sat down with Aiden in the mess hall, the cool glow of the fluorescent lights casting an almost eerie atmosphere over the room. The others had gone to their quarters, leaving us alone with our thoughts. I glanced at Aiden, who was silently staring at the table, lost in thought. You ever wonder what our lives would have been like if we hadn't walked into this place? I asked, my voice low. Aiden looked up at me, his expression unreadable for a moment before a faint, wry smile tugged at his lips. I used to wonder that, but the truth is, this is who we were always meant to be. We didn't choose this, but it chose us. We just have to make sure we don't let it consume us. I nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The power inside us, inside me, felt like a fire burning at the edge of my consciousness, always threatening to take over. But it wasn't just the power that scared me. It was the purpose that came with it. What if I lost myself in the fight? What if I became just another pawn in a game I didn't understand? But Aiden's words had a grounding effect on me. We didn't have to let the power control us. We could control it. Together. Do you ever regret it? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Joining this fight? What if we lose? Aiden took a deep breath, his eyes locking with mine. Regret? Not yet. But the price of victory is high. The price of failing, even higher. I swallowed hard. What happens if Langley wins, Aiden? His eyes darkened, and for the first time, I saw something flicker in them. Fear, maybe? Or perhaps a deep, unspoken sadness. If Langley wins, there will be no world left to fight for. He won't just control the future. He'll rewrite it. Destroy it. He believes power is the only thing worth anything, Daniel, and he'll tear down anyone who stands in his way. I shuddered at the thought. Langley's ambition was as dangerous as it was limitless. He wasn't just a man. He was a force, a storm of ambition and madness that had already claimed countless lives. And if we failed, if we didn't stop him, there was no telling what the world would look like in his wake. The plan unfolds. A few days later, we gathered for a meeting in the war room, a high-tech, dimly lit space filled with monitors and digital maps of various cities, military compounds, and unknown locations. The woman, the one who had brought me into this world, was there, as was Aiden. Her name, I had finally learned, was Seraphine. She was the leader of the resistance here at the Haven, but her past was shrouded in mystery. It seemed like she had been part of this fight long before I had ever heard of Langley or his plans. "Everything is in place," Seraphine said, standing at the head of the table, a steely resolve in her voice. "We've gathered intel, built alliances, and prepared as best as we can. But Langley will not go down easily. He has resources beyond anything we've encountered before. This won't be a simple battle." Aiden nodded, his face grim. "So, what's the plan?" Seraphine's fingers hovered over the holographic display on the table, flicking through images of Langley's known hideouts. "We strike at his core, his central facility. If we can disrupt his network, we'll throw him off balance long enough to deal a major blow. But it won't be easy. We're going to need everything we've got." My mind raced. Langley's core facility, the heart of his operation. It was heavily fortified, heavily guarded, and incredibly well protected. To assault it head-on would be suicide. We needed more than strength. We needed strategy. "I know what you're thinking," Seraphine continued, sensing the hesitation in the room. "This isn't just about brute force. It's about hitting him where it hurts, cutting off his resources, breaking his network of control. Once we've done that, we can go in and finish this." Aiden and I exchanged a glance. It felt like we were walking a tightrope. One misstep, and everything would come crashing down. But there was no turning back. Not now. The final assault. The air was thick with tension as we approached Langley's fortress. A cold breeze swept across the barren landscape, ruffling our hair and sending a chill down my spine. We had assembled a small but powerful force, each one of us equipped with tools, knowledge, and abilities to make this final push our last and most decisive. The sky above was overcast, the dark clouds mirroring the weight of the moment. I glanced at Aiden, standing by my side, his face expressionless, but his eyes alive with purpose. His fingers flexed, ready to channel his energy in the fight to come. Beside him, Seraphine led the charge, her every step calculating and sure. "You know what to do," Seraphine said, her voice steady as we made our way toward the entrance of Langley's stronghold. "We breach the perimeter, disrupt their communications, and create a window for Daniel and Aiden to get to the heart of the facility. Once you're inside, you'll need to disable the core system. We can't risk Langley having control over anything once we breach." I nodded, my breath steady despite the pounding of my heart. My mind was already racing, planning for every possible scenario. We had no room for failure. Every move had to be perfect. There was no backup plan, no second chance. Langley had built this fortress for a reason. It was the nerve center of his operations, and if we didn't succeed in taking it down, we would be fighting an uphill battle for the rest of our lives. The perimeter was fortified, heavily guarded with watchtowers, cameras, and automated drones, patrolling the area. It was impenetrable. It was designed to be impenetrable. But we were prepared. Breach of the Fortress Seraphine's team made the first move, expertly disabling the outer defense systems one by one. Each blow was calculated, silent as if the very air held its breath with us. As the last of the perimeter defenses fell, the main gates groaned open, and we entered the fortress. The first floor was eerily quiet. No soldiers, no signs of life. Too quiet. It felt like a trap, but there was no turning back now. "We keep moving," Seraphine whispered. "Aiden, Daniel, you know your part." We moved swiftly, navigating through the halls, our footsteps muffled by the thick metal floors. The heart of the compound was located at the very center of the building, deep underground. We had to descend through a series of labyrinthine tunnels, each one darker and more oppressive than the last. The walls felt alive, as though they were watching us, waiting for our every move. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Aiden murmured as we descended into the depths. "You're not the only one," I replied, my voice tight with unease. The further we went, the more intense the pressure became. I could feel the power within me thrumming with anticipation, but it felt different now, darker, as though it was reacting to the environment. Something wasn't right. A twisted revelation. Just as we reached the final set of stairs that led to the central control room, the lights flickered, the temperature dropped suddenly, sending a chill through my bones, and then a voice. "Did you really think you could stop me?" The voice was smooth, dripping with arrogance, reverberating through the cold metallic walls. I froze. It was Langley. He appeared on a monitor embedded in the wall, his face twisted in a grin of cold, ruthless confidence. "You've been nothing but pawns, Daniel. All of you. You've been playing into my hands from the moment you set foot in the Haven." My heart pounded. How did he know? How was he here? "We've been watching you," Langley continued. "Every move, every conversation, every misstep. You were never in control. You never could be." His eyes glinted with malice. "And now? Now it's too late." The screens surrounding us buzzed to life, and a series of horrifying images began to flash across them. Soldiers, innocent people, and children, each subjected to experiments, their lives twisted and ruined for Langley's gain. I felt bile rise in my throat as I saw the faces of those who had been taken, those who had already fallen prey to his ambitions. Aiden's hand clenched into a fist, his body tense with fury. "You monster!" he hissed. Langley's smirk widened. "I don't need to lift a finger. The systems are already in place. My army will rise. Your mission was already doomed from the start." Seraphine's face hardened as she turned to us. "We've been expecting this. Prepare yourselves." But before we could react, the fortress seemed to come alive. The floor beneath our feet shook, alarms blared, and the lights turned red, bathing us in an ominous glow. A series of metal gates slammed shut, trapping us within the control room. "Surrounded," Aiden muttered, his voice full of frustration. Langley's voice echoed once more. "You may have breached the perimeter, but this is where your story ends. I've already triggered the fail-safes. No one leaves here alive." The walls of the control room began to hum with energy. The dawn of a new era. The dust from the collapsing fortress settled like a heavy blanket over the land. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and the echoing silence of destruction. The ground beneath us trembled, not from the battle we had just fought, but from the force of a world shifting underfoot. Langley's fortress, his empire, was in ruins, but the world was not yet at peace. I stood in the wreckage, my breath shallow, heart pounding in my chest. The power within me still hummed, but it felt different. The storm had passed, but the calm that followed was almost as unsettling as the chaos. Aiden and Seraphine approached, their expressions just as worn and tired as mine, but there was something in their eyes that spoke of hope, something I hadn't dared to believe in for so long. "Is it over?" Aiden asked, his voice quiet, as if unsure whether he was asking me or himself. I wiped the blood from my lip, my mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. We had won, yes, but it didn't feel like a final victory. It felt like the beginning of something much larger, something that would demand everything from us. "I don't know," I said, my voice steady despite the uncertainty that gnawed at me. "But we've broken the chains at least." Seraphine looked around at the wreckage, her gaze hard and calculating. "Langley's influence has crumbled, but we still have a war to fight. The pieces are scattered, but the warlords he once commanded will not fall easily. There are factions, remnants of his army that will rise up and attempt to seize control. Then we stop them," Aiden said, his voice firm. "We finish what we started." Seraphine nodded, her lips curling into a tight smile. We will. But not alone. We need to unite the fractured forces, forge new alliances, and rebuild the world that Langley tried to destroy. The unseen war as. The days turned into weeks. We moved swiftly to secure what remained of Langley's operations. The remnants of his army scattered, but their control over various regions was still strong. There were pockets of resistance, those who were loyal to Langley, who believed in his vision of a world ruled by strength and power. They were the ones we now had to face. The world had changed irrevocably. Cities that had once been bustling, metropolises lay in ruins, their inhabitants scattered and confused. The haven, once our refuge, had become a symbol of what we had accomplished, but also of what still remained to be done. Aiden and I were at the forefront of the rebuilding effort, but the weight of the task was heavier than anything we'd ever faced. The power within us was no longer just a tool for survival, it was a responsibility, a burden we would carry for the rest of our lives. Every decision we made would ripple through the world, for better or worse. The first step was to rebuild the network of alliances, bringing together the fractured factions that had been torn apart by Langley's reign. Seraphine took on the task of diplomatic negotiations, her cold, calculated mind an asset in the delicate balancing act. Aiden and I focused on the groundwork, laying the foundation for the new world. We worked tirelessly, establishing communication channels, securing resources, and preparing for the inevitable battles that would come. But the peace was fragile. The war was not over. Langley's fall had created a power vacuum, and those who sought to take his place were already gathering their forces. New leaders, some driven by ambition, others by desperation, began to emerge from the shadows. They were the ones who believed that the world needed a ruler, someone who could impose order through force. One evening, as I sat alone in the war room, reviewing the latest intelligence reports, the doors creaked open. Aiden stepped in, his expression tense. "You've seen the latest report," he said, his voice low. I nodded, the weight of the situation settling over me once more. "The warlords are starting to rally. Langley's closest lieutenants are, taking advantage of the power vacuum. If we don't act fast, we'll lose everything we've gained," Aiden finished for me. His eyes flashed with a mixture of determination and uncertainty. "But we don't have the resources for another war, not yet." I leaned back in my chair, my mind working through the problem, the strategies. We had to be smarter this time. We couldn't afford to fight every battle head-on. We needed to outmaneuver our enemies. "We'll need to strike fast," I said, determination setting in. "Disrupt their alliances before they can solidify. Take out their key leaders, weaken their support base. We can't give them time to build an army." Aiden nodded, but there was a shadow of doubt in his eyes. "What if we don't have enough time to prepare? What if they come at us first?" I stood up, the weight of the decision bearing down on me. "Then we make time. We lead this world. Aiden, we take charge before someone else does." The shifting foundations, the world we had once known, the fractured, desperate world where power was the ultimate currency, was slipping away. But the remnants of that broken world still clung to the edges of the new order we were trying to build. Even as we laid the foundations for something better, the shadows of old power structures lingered. Our path forward was not without resistance. The new order we envisioned wasn't going to be birthed without struggle. In the hearts of the remaining warlords and power-hungry factions, there was fear. Fear that they would be left powerless in a world that was no longer built on might. Their influence was still potent, their networks vast, and they would not give up easily. But this time, we were no longer fighting to merely survive. We were fighting for a world where survival wasn't the measure of one's worth. It became clear that our victory wasn't just about taking down Langley and his empire. It was about transforming the very nature of power itself. And for that transformation, we needed allies. Real allies the kind of alliances that weren't based on coercion, fear, or mutual destruction, but on shared values and a vision for a better future. The gathering storm months passed, and as we began to reshape the political landscape, I saw Aiden's determination shift into something else, something deeper, more resilient. We were no longer the same people we had been before Langley's fall. Each day, the pressure of leadership pushed us further, demanding more sacrifices. But in the midst of it, Aiden had become something more than a soldier. He had become a visionary, someone who could see beyond the rubble, beyond the scars of the past. One day, as I walked through the new settlement we had built near the remains of Langley's fortress, I found him standing alone, overlooking the vast expanse of rebuilt homes and workshops, the horizon stretching before us like an unwritten page. His eyes, once full of doubt, were now focused, determined, and full of quiet hope. "It's not perfect," he said, almost as if reading my mind. I stepped beside him, glancing out at the horizon. "Nothing ever is," I replied. "But it's a start." He looked at me then, his gaze intense as if measuring something, measuring us, and nodded. "A start is all we need, but we can't rest. This is only one part of the change we need to see." Langley built his empire through manipulation, through fear. We build ours through trust. And if we do that right, we can change the entire system, show the world a different way of living. I felt the weight of his words, as though the responsibility had just been handed to me again, but this time with a renewed sense of purpose. The world had changed because of us, but we had to keep changing it, one step at a time. But just as we were finding our footing, I sensed something on the horizon, something I couldn't ignore. An old enemy, a different threat, the hidden hand it. Was early one morning when the first sign of the threat appeared. An encrypted message, urgent, cryptic, was delivered to me through one of our trusted informants. "They are coming. Not just the warlords, something more dangerous. A shadow faction. The Phoenix. They have infiltrated our networks. They are watching us." I stared at the message, the words sinking into my chest like cold metal. The Phoenix. The name rang in my mind, familiar but distant, like a forgotten nightmare. This was not a name we had heard in years. The Phoenix had once been a legend, a shadowy organization that had operated in the darkness, rumored to have the power to dismantle entire regimes without ever being seen. They were whispers in the wind, remnants of a bygone era. If they were resurfacing now, it meant we were not alone in our pursuit of change. I turned to Aiden, who had been watching me with quiet intensity. "It's them," I said, my voice low. "The Phoenix. They're not just watching us, they're actively sabotaging our efforts." Aiden's brow furrowed. "How do we stop them?" I exhaled slowly, the weight of the situation bearing down on me once again. "We'll need to root them out, find their leaders, cut off their resources. But this time, we don't act blindly. We need to know who they are, what they want." And so began our investigation into the shadow faction known as the Phoenix. They were elusive. No one had ever seen their true leaders. There were rumors that they operated through a network of high-level agents infiltrating governments, organizations, and even our own ranks. Every lead we followed led us into deeper and darker corners of the world. It wasn't just about physical power anymore. It was about information, control over knowledge, over how people perceived us, how they perceived the world. The Phoenix thrived on secrecy, on manipulation. Their power wasn't in armies, it was in influence. Unmasking the enemy days turned into weeks, and our efforts to track down the Phoenix seemed to hit dead ends at every turn.